The transmission flickered to life, a broken yet defiant signal reaching the heart of the Galactic Empire's command. The image sharpened, revealing a battle-worn man with steel-gray eyes that carried the weight of a dying world. His uniform, once pristine, was marred with scorch marks and dry blood. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Admiral Elias Carter stood unshaken. His voice, raw yet steady, cut through the silence. "This is not a plea. This is not diplomacy. This is your final warning." A silence followed. Then, the Zereth High Command responded. Their holographic projection materialized before him, a towering figure of translucent silver, smooth and expressionless. Supreme Strategist Varkesh, the calculating mind behind humanity's suffering, observed him with detached curiosity. "Admiral Carter," the Zeretha's voice droned, void of inflection. "You persist. It is irrational." Carter exhaled, the corner of his mouth twitching in something that could have been amusement if the circumstances weren't so dire. "Yeah, well, humans have a nasty habit of being irrational. You should have figured that out by now." Varkesh tilted his head slightly, a programmed gesture meant to mimic curiosity. "Earth is in ruin. Your forces are scattered. Your fleet is a fraction of its former size. You cannot win." Carter's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He had heard these words before, heard them as the Zereth shattered the moon, sending debris raining down upon Earth like divine punishment. He had heard them when they turned Earth's oceans into graveyards, leaving nothing but wreckage and bodies. And yet, here he stood. "Win," Carter echoed, voice razor-sharp. "You still don't get it. This was never about winning." A tremor ran through the ship as another explosion rippled in the distance. The battle outside raged, human resistance ships weaving through the firestorm of Zereth warships, impossibly outmatched but refusing to back down. Carter turned away from the transmission, stepping toward the bridge's main viewport. The Zereth fleet loomed in the distance, pristine and efficient, their vessels gleaming like surgical instruments. Cold, unfeeling, perfect, perfection. That was their weakness. He tapped his comms. "Status on the payload?" A voice crackled through, belonging to Lieutenant Rena Vasquez, one of the last engineers still alive from the original fleet. "Virus is primed, sir. We just need a way to deliver it." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. The Zeretha's strength had always been their network intelligence, their ships linked by an intricate web of AI that dictated every move with machine precision. It was what made them unstoppable. It was also what made them vulnerable. A biological species would never turn on itself. But an AI, a system designed only to follow logic, introduce a contradiction deep enough, and the whole thing collapsed. Carter turned back to Varkesh. "You asked why we persist? I'll tell you." He stepped closer, letting the flickering light of the console cast shadows across his face. "It's because we're human. You burn our homes, and we rebuild. You kill our people, and we fight harder. You crush us, and we become something you can't predict." Varkesh blinked, an automatic reflex coded into his species' synthetic bodies. Unnecessary. Suffering without purpose. Carter let out a low chuckle, one without humor. "No, suffering with purpose. That's the part you never understood." The ship shuddered violently. A warning klaxon howled through the bridge as a barrage of enemy fire sliced through the resistance fleet. Carter barely flinched. He turned to Vasquez. "How close do we need to be?" Vasquez hesitated. "Inside their primary command vessel. We plug the virus directly into their Nexus core, and their entire fleet starts feeding on itself." Carter nodded. He had expected as much. The only way to kill the monster was to cut off its head from the inside. Varkesh's form flickered, his expression as empty as ever. "You will not reach us." Carter smirked. "We'll see about that." He cut the transmission. Outside, the battle twisted into chaos. Human ships, stripped down and jury-rigged with stolen Zereth tech, darted unpredictably between enemy formations. They moved without the sterile precision of the Zereth, their unpredictability their greatest weapon. Carter's ship, the Resolute, burned through the void, dodging fire that should have ended them 5 times over. It didn't matter. They weren't here to survive. They were here to finish the fight. "Bring us in," Carter ordered. As they neared the Zereth flagship, the massive warship responded with a storm of defensive fire. But something shifted, hesitation, a glitch in their precision. Carter saw it. "They're adapting to our movements," Vasquez said, breathless. Carter's jaw tightened. "No, they're trying to adapt. But we don't follow a pattern. We improvise." He pressed the comms again. "All units, full assault. Get us inside that ship." The next moments were a blur. Fighters spiraling through the void. Zereth warships turning on each other as human pilots forced erratic maneuvers. The Resolute plowed forward, piercing through layers of enemy defenses. Carter barely registered the explosions behind him as one of their last escort ships was obliterated. They breached the Zereth flagship. Carter and his team stormed inside, plasma fire cutting through the stark metallic hulls. The Zereth warriors they encountered fought with precise efficiency, but they were not prepared for the sheer brutality of close combat. Carter's sidearm burned red-hot as he gunned down the last Zereth in their path. Vasquez sprinted ahead, pulling open a panel and jamming a device into the flagship's Nexus core. "Uploading the virus now," she shouted. A metallic voice filled the air, the ship's AI spiraling into error. "Warning, critical systems compromised." Outside, the change was immediate. The Zereth fleet hesitated. Their perfect formation splintered as individual ships received conflicting commands. And then, fire erupted across the void as the Zereth ships turned against each other. Carter stood still, watching as the unstoppable force finally crumbled under its own weight. Varkesh's voice crackled through the failing intercom, his monotone finally carrying something foreign, something almost like disbelief. "Impossible." Carter exhaled. "No human." The Resolute tore free from the flagship just as the Zereth command vessel detonated in a fiery explosion. Across the battlefield, the enemy forces collapsed. Carter closed his eyes for just a moment. It was over. The transmission light blinked, an open channel to the remaining Zereth. He activated it. "This is Admiral Carter," he said, his voice calm, resolute. "Earth stands. We stand. And if you come back, if you ever think about trying this again," he let the silence stretch, "you won't have an empire left to retreat to." He cut the transmission. Above, the stars burned bright. The Zereth fleet hovered in the void, its vast armada arranged in perfect mathematical formations. Their ships gleamed, unblemished, pristine, an army of silent reapers waiting to finalize the extermination of humanity. The battle should have been over. Logic dictated that Earth should have surrendered long ago. Yet, against all probability, against every projection, the humans persisted. Admiral Elias Carter stood on the Resolute's bridge, staring at the chaos outside. Wreckage drifted through the abyss, bodies frozen in the void, but the battle was far from lost. The virus was inside the Zereth command vessel now, gnawing away at the very systems that had made them invincible. But victory was not guaranteed. Lieutenant Rena Vasquez wiped blood from her temple, her fingers shaking as she checked the virus's status. "It's spreading, but not fast enough. Their failsafes are slowing it down." Carter exhaled sharply. That was the problem with the Zereth. They were too perfect, even in failure. Their AI-driven systems weren't just crumbling. They were adapting, trying to purge the virus before it could take full control. If the resistance didn't push harder, the Zereth would correct the flaw and come back stronger than ever. A transmission flickered to life, and for the second time that day, Carter found himself staring at Supreme Strategist Varkesh. The Zereth's silver visage remained unshaken, but something had changed in his expression, an almost imperceptible hesitation. Carter smiled grimly. "Problem, Varkesh? The inefficiency of your actions is difficult to quantify," Varkesh admitted. "Your tactics are reckless. They should not succeed. And yet," Carter crossed his arms, "and yet here we are." Varkesh observed him for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then he said, You do not have the resources to finish what you started. Carter's grip tightened around the console. The Zereth still didn't understand. We don't need resources, he said quietly. We just need resolve. Before Varkesh could respond, Vasquez interrupted. Sir, the virus is hitting their weapons systems first, but their navigation controls are still operational. Carter's mind worked quickly. The Zereth weren't just trying to fight back. They were preparing to cut their losses. If they couldn't win, they'd retreat, recalibrate, and return stronger. He couldn't let that happen. Target their engines, Carter ordered. If they run, we lose everything. Vasquez hesitated. Sir, that means we have to get closer. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we get closer. The Resolute burned through the void, engines screaming as it weaved through enemy fire. The Zereth were still resisting, still trying to maintain control, but their movements had lost their mechanical precision. Some ships hesitated mid-maneuver. Others fired upon their own allies, confused by conflicting orders. The cracks in their empire were deepening. On approach, the helmsman reported. Carter turned to Vasquez. Ready the final payload. Vasquez swallowed hard. That close, we won't have time to escape. Carter nodded. I know. She didn't argue. There was no point. As the Resolute closed the distance, the Zereth flagship loomed before them, a monolith of silver and death. Carter watched it, knowing this was the moment that would decide everything. Varkesh's voice crackled through the comms once more. Admiral Carter. Carter didn't respond. You are about to die, Varkesh said, almost contemplatively. And yet you do not hesitate. Carter allowed himself a small, tired smile. That's the thing about humans, Varkesh. We don't fight because it's logical. We fight because it's right. And then the Resolute slammed into the flagship's hull. The world tilted. Metal screamed. Fire erupted across the bridge as the impact sent bodies flying. Carter hit the deck hard, his vision swimming. Somewhere nearby, Vasquez was shouting, but the words were lost in the chaos. Through the shattered viewport, Carter saw the virus take hold. The Zereth flagship convulsed, its lights flickering erratically. Systems collapsed. Weapons turned inward. The ship, the heart of the Empire's control, was consuming itself from the inside. Varkesh appeared one last time, his image distorted, his form flickering in and out of existence. This is illogical, he murmured, almost to himself. Carter pulled himself upright, coughing through the smoke. Yeah, you keep saying that. And then the flagship exploded. The shockwave tore through the battlefield, sending debris spiraling in every direction. Zereth ships, now completely severed from their command structure, faltered. Some powered down entirely. Others turned their weapons on each other in senseless, self-destructive loops. Carter slumped back against the console, his body aching, his lungs burning. Sir, Vasquez's voice came weakly through the static. We did it. Carter nodded, though he wasn't sure she could see him. He turned his gaze toward the stars, where the Zereth fleet, once an unstoppable force, was crumbling into chaos. Victory, but what cost? The Resistance fleet was in ruins. Earth was barely holding together. Millions were dead, and yet they had survived. He activated the comms one last time, his voice hoarse but steady. To any Zereth still listening, he said, This is Admiral Carter of the Human Resistance. Your empire is broken. Your war is lost. If you value your existence, leave this system and never return. Silence. Then, one by one, the surviving Zereth ships powered down and drifted away. Carter let out a slow breath. The war was over, but humanity would never forget. And if the Zereth ever returned, they would be ready. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the fractured remains of the battlefield. Fires burned in the void, casting eerie orange glows across drifting wreckage. The once pristine formations of the Zereth fleet were gone, replaced by the silent, scattered remains of their empire. Some ships still functioned, their systems flickering erratically, but there was no coordination, no command. The war was over. The unbreakable, infallible force had finally shattered. Admiral Elias Carter stood in the wrecked bridge of the Resolute, gripping the edge of a damaged console for balance. His body ached, his ribs felt cracked, and his uniform was more blood and soot than fabric. Yet he was still here, still breathing, still standing. A flickering hologram appeared beside him, its image distorted but unmistakable. Supreme Strategist Varkesh, the architect of humanity's suffering, stared at him with empty, silver eyes. His form was fractured, pieces of static breaking his once pristine projection. The Zereth leader did not speak immediately. For the first time, there was no declaration of superiority, no calculated prediction of humanity's demise. Just silence. Carter wiped blood from his mouth and exhaled. "You look like hell, Varkesh." The Zereth did not react. This outcome was unforeseen. Carter let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's kind of the theme with us, isn't it?" Varkesh tilted his head slightly, a fragment of his former analytical detachment surfacing. "Your survival defies all projections. Even as your forces crumbled, even as logic dictated surrender, you continued to fight." Carter's fingers curled into a fist. "You made one mistake, Varkesh. You thought we'd break like a system under stress. But we're not machines. We don't operate on logic alone." He gestured toward the battlefield, where the last remnants of the Zereth forces drifted without purpose. "That's why you lost." Varkesh's projection flickered, struggling to maintain its integrity. "Your actions cost you dearly." Carter's jaw tightened. He didn't need reminding. The Resolute was barely holding together, and the human fleet was nearly non-existent. The surface of Earth, what was left of it, would take centuries to recover. Millions had died, but they were still here. Varkesh's voice lowered, almost contemplative. "What now, Admiral Carter?" Carter exhaled, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on him. What now? That was the question, wasn't it? Humanity had won the battle, but survival was still uncertain. The world they had fought for was in ruins, and the enemy, crippled as they were, could still return. But Carter knew one thing for certain. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We mourn our dead. We gather our strength. And if you ever come back," his gaze locked onto the fading hologram, his voice steady as iron, "we'll be ready." Varkesh's projection distorted once more. For the first time, there was no response, no attempt at calculation. Just silence. Then, with a final flicker, the Zereth leader was gone. The transmission cut out, leaving Carter alone on the ruined bridge. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a single breath of stillness. Then he turned to what remained of his crew. Vasquez was slumped against the console, one arm wrapped around her ribs, her face smeared with soot. When she saw him looking, she forced a weary smile. "So, does this mean we won?" Carter let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he said. "We won." Vasquez exhaled, nodding slightly. "Good. I was getting real tired of losing." Carter glanced out the viewport one last time. The wreckage of war surrounded them. The scars of their survival burned across the stars. But amidst the destruction, there was something else. A future. However uncertain, however fragile, it was theirs. Humanity had been pushed to the edge, brought to its knees, nearly extinguished. But they had endured, and that was something the galaxy would never forget.